So, here's the thing. I set up my camera yesterday in church to record the sermon. Well, I was running a little late, I was in a hurry, and I didn't push the record button. So I got nothing. So this morning, I'm still punishing myself for my stupid mistake. So I figured, well, I might as well just go ahead and record the sermon and post it, because I know how much so many of you will miss it if I don't. So, here it is. You know, it's about the Christmas story. And since it's such a familiar story, I thought I'd start with a little quiz. Now don't worry, we live in an enlightened society, so this quiz won't be graded, and all answers are right, even if they're wrong. So the quiz went like this. Where was Jesus born? A, in an inn. B, in a stable. C, in a house. D, in the Paradise Cycle Shop. Well, the congregation talked it over and consulted, and they checked with the nativity scene that was under the Christmas tree, and they decided it was a stable. So that's our starting point. So we decided, you know what? Let's just research that a little bit. Luke 2, verse 7 says this, "And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn." That's the story we know and love, right? It's very straightforward. But let's just dig down a little bit deeper. You know, as it happens almost every time we have a sermon or research anything, we wind up with a little lesson in Greek. Well, the Greek word for inn is pandaion. Now, pandaion is a word that Luke used elsewhere in the book of Luke. It was part of the Good Samaritan story. Now, oftentimes we do this when we're exposing some biblical verses. We first look to see how that particular author uses the word in different contexts, so that we can understand his understanding of the word, so we can see it from the same perspective. So in the story of the Good Samaritan set him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. An inn, pandaion. So is that the word that Luke used in the Christmas story? It is not. The word that Luke used in that story is kataluma. He uses the word kataluma also in another story, the story of the upper room, where Jesus sent his disciples to say to the owner of the house, "Where is the guest room?" Kataluma. Kataluma means guest room. Well, now that we've established that, we've got to wonder, does it really make any difference? After all, an inn is nothing more than a building full of guest rooms, right? So we have to look further, contextually and culturally, to what this all means in the time of Jesus, the first century in Bethlehem. Bethlehem. we have to wonder, it's a small town. A little town. It says so in the song, "O little town of Bethlehem." It was such a small town. You have to wonder, did they really even have an inn in Bethlehem? That's curious. Inns at that time were spread along major routes 15 to 20 miles apart. Well, Bethlehem, the small, tiny town, sat only between 5 and 6 miles from Jerusalem, that huge city. Now, Jerusalem certainly had inns, but why would there be an inn so close as Bethlehem? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Secondly, you know what? Inns had a horrible reputation in those days. They were dens of iniquity, horrible drunkenness and debauchery. Joseph would have only gone to an inn as a very last resort. But was this a last resort? He had a pregnant bride. Well, I got to wondering. So I looked up the distance from Nazareth, their starting point, to Bethlehem. You know what it was? Nobody in the church had a guess. 80 miles. They had traveled 80 miles. Which for a healthy person walking briskly would have been a 4-day journey. Under the circumstances, it was most likely 6 or 7 days that they were traveling through the hill country from Nazareth to Bethlehem. What'd they do for all those nights? I'm thinking they left prepared for a week-long journey. I'm guessing that they had a tent. Or they were traveling in a caravan, because there were lots of people traveling because of the census. One way or the other, they moved relatively slowly. The pictures always show Mary riding on a donkey. That's doubtful. She was a healthy peasant teenage girl, perfectly capable of walking, and walking much faster than a donkey. Donkeys slow your journey down. So, at any rate, one way or the other, they were on the road many nights and managed to sleep somewhere. Then all of a sudden, when they get to Bethlehem, they had to sleep in a dirty old barn, a stable, because there was no room in an inn that probably didn't exist in the first place. That's something to consider. But you say, hey, speaking of that stable, now that's pretty plain. That's in the Bible. They stayed in a stable. Well, did they? You know what? The word stable is nowhere in any of the stories of the Nativity in the Bible. As a matter of fact, the word stable does not appear in the entire New Testament, and appears only once in the Old Testament. So in the whole entire Bible, it's only once in the Old Testament, in Ezekiel, Rabbah, I will make Rabbah a stable for camels. Certainly not part of the Christmas story. So, if the word stable isn't there, where do we get this idea? Of course, from the manger. The manger is a feeding trough for animals. And where else do you find a feeding trough for animals? Well, in a stable or a barn, somewhere where animals are kept. Well, that's pretty plain. Then there must have been a stable. Let's dig a little deeper. Let's think about the architecture of a first century peasant home in Bethlehem. Homes at that time were built with a family room, probably a relatively sizable room given the size of the house. You have a family room, that's where the family eats, that's where the family sleeps, that's where they read the Torah, if they're fortunate enough to have one, discuss stories and things that families do. Now, attached to, but separate from the family room, is the Cataluma, the guest room. Mosaic law demanded hospitality of the Jews. They were always to welcome visitors, particularly those from their own line, from their own house, whether they knew them or not. So they had the guest room. And when they didn't have company, they probably stored the Christmas decorations there, don't you think? Well, maybe not. Well, anyway, they had the guest room, the family room, and then, if I were in the sanctuary, I'd walk down, and I'd be on the main level, which would be dirt, and it opens right up into the outside through a door, and this is where the animals stayed. Yes, they kept the animals in a room attached to or within their house. The body heat from the animals helped to keep the family warm during the cold nights. Plus, very importantly, between the family and the entrance to the house was this place where the animals slept. Goats, sheep, lambs, dogs that would help to control the animals. If an intruder were to try to come into that house in the middle of the night, the family might be sound asleep, but the dogs and the animals are going to make a commotion that will wake up the master of the house, and it would not be a good thing for an intruder. A wonderful, wonderful alarm system. They were pretty smart. So it is entirely possible that Jesus was born in a house. After all, you see, you had the animals in the house, so you had mangers in the house. So everything was there for them to stay in a home. After all, Mosaic law nearly commanded that their relatives would accept them. After all, they were from the house of David, going to the city of David. They almost certainly had relatives. Now, I asked one more question yesterday. That's a simpler question, I suppose. When did Mary go into labor? When she first arrived? That night? The next day? Some days later? Well, we have to look again at what Luke says. What Luke says is Luke 2, verse 6. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she would be delivered. It is probable that Joseph and Mary were there for some number of days before Jesus was born. So that's some thoughts to ponder. You know, I like the idea that Jesus was born among family and friends. I like to picture Joseph and Mary getting to town, Joseph inquiring about where a family member might live. He knocks on the door, says, "Hi, I'm Joseph, your second cousin from Nazareth. You know, I'm a carpenter up there." "Oh, Joseph, I've heard of you." "Yes, indeed. Welcome. Please come in. Hey, do you know what? My wife's uncle and his family came in yesterday for the census. They're staying in the Cataluma. So unfortunately, there's no room in the guest room for you, but you are more than welcome to stay here in the family room with us. And then when the baby comes, we could use one of these mangers to make a crib." That's a good idea. And then, you know, Uncle Fred and his family, they're going to leave as soon as this census baloney is all taken care of. Then you folks can move into the Cataluma. Stay as long as you want. A carpenter can get plenty of work here in Bethlehem. Now, I can't say that's the way it went, but I can tell you this. That story fits the narrative of the biblical story of the Nativity every bit as well as that story about the grumpy innkeeper. And I like it a lot better. Amen.